Mr. Fowler, you're recognized, sir.
Thank you. Members of the committee, David Fowler, Family Action of Tennessee, former member of the General Assembly, attorney licensed to practice law in the state of Tennessee. Let me explain that what's begun to happen in this country, and I have an email from David French, a Harvard graduate, law graduate, practices with the American Center for Law and Justice, who's been working on the matter at Vanderbilt, who was previously with the Freedom and Individual Rights and Education Association, and prior to that, the Alliance Defense Fund, who just sent me an email because I realized this bill, I was not anticipating it being up today for reasons I won't get into. But he said what is beginning to happen is schools, particularly the public colleges, are not applying the all-comers policies. Now, for those of you who were here in the past, you knew that that was the issue at Vanderbilt, which was approved by the United States Supreme Court, where you said all campus groups have to allow anybody, all comers, to be members or officers. Because that has conflicted with the problems with fraternities, which, as you'll recall, at Vanderbilt, were not required to accept anybody, even people of the same sex as the fraternity or the sorority, colleges have begun to use their non-discrimination policies that we have that have just been described to you to interpret them in ways that all of a sudden say, we don't have to have an all-comers policy because that presents problems. We'd have to include fraternities and sororities. They got lots of money. They get really mad. We can't do that. So they take the very policy that was described to you and by simply a change of administration say you are now discriminating on the basis of sex or sexual orientation or gender identity by not allowing people to be in your religious group because your religious group maybe doesn't adhere to those values. So the very policy that we have, all it's going to take is somebody coming to them and saying, hey, I'm not allowed to join, because they're now violating my rights under the non-discrimination policy, and that's exactly what happened at Vanderbilt. Exactly. They didn't have to change a policy originally. A student got kicked out of an organization because of a change in his belief system between his election as an officer in the spring and the beginning of the fall, and they said, we're removing you. Vanderbilt said, oh, that violates the non-discrimination policy, because you're denying them admission to your group based on their sex and sexual orientation and all of that. Then Vanderbilt came up with it's an all-comers policy as an excuse. But you have to appreciate this very policy that was just read to you is the very policy that other public and private institutions are, by just change of attitude, all of a sudden saying, oh, now you're violating our policy. So in answer to your question, do we have a policy in place that prevents what I've just described? Absolutely not. In fact, it's the very policy that will be used by somebody to go in and assert that if you don't let me join them, now you are discriminating against me. That's why we need this bill. So in answer to your question, it's not just about all-comers policies. And I think the point well taken about religion, actually, as a lawyer, I would disagree. The more you define what a religion is, the more you open yourself up to a lawsuit with somebody now having all these definitions that can say, well, I actually meet this one. I would argue that if I was the board, I would want as much discretion to interpret it what it was, so that if I had some group come in and say, we're a member of the sexist, that we have to have sex with all the college freshmen, you can say, I don't think that's a real religion. You start trying to define something, and then somebody's going to argue somehow I meet the definition. So they've been figuring out what religion has been ever since the Civil Rights Acts without somebody defining it. And to now come in and say, I can't tell what a religion is, means they've probably not been upholding the civil rights laws since the 60s. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to address it, but it is the very policy that was articulated that is now being used to avoid the all-comers policies and being used to tell the Christian groups, you got to leave. So that's why this bill is important. Thank you.
President Kane, you're recognized, sir. While we're out of recess, Mr.
Representative Pody listed a whole bunch of other states that had issues come up. Can you expound on any of these to kind of give us a perspective? Because right now we don't have one, so I kind of want to understand what happens in these other states that we see fit to bring this bill forward?
Well, essentially what's happened at these other institutions is what happened at Vanderbilt. Now, for you to appreciate what happened at Vanderbilt, which I know this is not a bill that addresses Vanderbilt, but for example, and I have a list in my computer, which I can print to you, but it's about this long, of all the impacts of not being a student group. For example, as was mentioned, you don't have a right to student fees. You may not have the same right to use the facilities. So the FCA wants to meet on campus. They may be treated the same as any outside group, not having any priority to use the campus facilities, nor maybe even being able to use them for free, like others would be able to do. For instance, at Vanderbilt, when they had the freshman fair and all the recognized student groups were allowed to put up their booths and say, hey, come join our group, FCA, Campus Crusade for Christ, Navigator, CLS were told you can't be at that fair because you're not a recognized student group. You lose access to the means of communication and your ability to post notices on campus in the same way as you would if you were a student group. You're more like an outside group. So the ability to use the university email systems or other channels of communications to let people know that you're having meetings or having groups, that gets wiped out too. So it becomes very hard to be able to communicate with the people you're wanting to communicate with because you can't reach them the same way everybody else can. So those are just a few of the things that I'd mentioned, and I got a list of about 20. If I could email them to somebody, I'll email them to you, and you can read them off your computer. But does that help a little bit? Yeah.
It just gives us more perspective on the situations that are going on in other states and the access to fees and things like that. Thank you.
Representative Love, do you have a question while we're in recess?
Yes, I did. Let me ask you a question. I've heard the language used, it's coming to Tennessee.
Right.
And maybe I'm using too crude or simple of a understanding. What are the indicators of it coming to Tennessee? I guess I'm thinking about the weather. You know, when I see it coming from the West Coast, you know, what indicators do we have, particularly since this incident with Vanderbilt was last year, correct?
It's an ongoing issue.
No, I mean, but the discussion came up last session, right?
Right.
So what happened in 1 year in the state of Tennessee that gives you indicators that it is coming to Tennessee when we haven't had anything to happen so far?
Well, I would submit that if I were counsel for the Board of Regents or UT and knew that this issue had been here last year, the last thing I would want to do is to move forward with a policy that I knew was under particular scrutiny. So I would have said you'd been a fool to have tried to move the weather forward over the last year in view of the fact the legislature is all upset about this issue. Now, what makes me think it will come to Tennessee?
Yes, sir.
The same reason that it's coming to places like the University of South Carolina, which is every bit as conservative as our state, for places like the University of Florida, Georgia Tech. It happened in Boise State. I mean, in the middle of, with all due respect to the people of Boise, nowhere. University of North Carolina, Oklahoma.
Well, I'm asking.
So I'm saying
did a
that
student
the
group
college,
show up at Tennessee State and couldn't get recognized, and they filed a complaint with Student Affairs and it didn't get to the board, but you have record of that? Did a student group file a complaint at UT Knoxville, but it didn't get to the board, but you have record of it? I'm looking for indicators, small measurable things that would say to you that it's moving in Tennessee, and we just don't know it yet, but you know it's moving, so that I can better understand how a year passes with the discussion, and we don't have any indicators of it, but you got some indicator of it. Just help me understand how you can see it's coming this way.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I guess I would have to say that in my experience and in my association with a couple of national organizations, with 35 organizations in different states, the movement that I have seen in particular to say that if you happen to disagree with certain sexual behaviors, that you are a bigot and a discriminatory person, is what's driven most of this. And those organizations that espouse that view, which they are free to do on a public college campus, are growing in size and in number and enforce, and it is simply a matter of time before one of their members decides that, hey, I don't think you should be able to tell me that I can't be in your religious organization, even though your historic position has always been that we do not have sex outside of marriage, period, of any kind with any person.
It's the increase in enrollment of certain groups.
What I'm saying is it's an increase in the view of human sexuality today, particularly among college campuses and particularly among college professors, particularly in view of the fact that the University of Memphis and the University of Tennessee faculty senates have already both virtually unanimously said that we think we ought to have same-sex partner benefits. I can see where the philosophy, perhaps, of the administration would be going.
And maybe I'm being too simplistic, but like when doctors notice that some people have a sniffle and it spreads as an epidemic, they look for the indicators of why it spread, and the flu may spread like that, and pneumonia doesn't because it's not contagious. So if someone comes in with pneumonia, we know that the whole room's not going to get sick. But if someone comes in with the flu, we know there's a possibility that everyone will get sick because that's how the flu spreads. I'm just trying to find out what's spreading in Tennessee that's giving an indication that it's coming here and we need to be aware of it, and we need to pass this out of subcommittee to full committee to protect Tennessee. That's all I'm asking.
Well, with all due respect, I've given you the best answer that I have.
That there are increased numbers of...
I can see the cultural trends across the country.
Okay.
I can see the bent of faculty at our universities. Okay, I can see where that's going. There's another bill up here about protecting religious liberty of students in certain counseling professions, that there are going to be a bunch of professors down here tomorrow all saying that you shouldn't have the freedom to not have to counsel people contrary to your religious beliefs. They're going to be here in the Senate tomorrow. So I see what's going on, and I would submit, with all due respect to the members of this committee, that it's just a matter of time, not because the board of UT or the board of regents wants to change their policy, but because they are forced to by somebody that forces them to have to address it and change it.
Thank you very much. Any further discussion? Representative Kane?
What was the thought process between it, why FCA and the Navigators and several other groups were not allowed to participate in the freshman fair? These are recognized groups on most campuses throughout this state and other states.
That's right, but not at Vanderbilt, because they interpreted their non-discrimination policy to say that if you believe that certain sexual practices are out the bounds of your religion, then you are discriminating. So FCA, InterVarsity, Campus Crusade, Christian Legal Society, the Baptist Association, there were 13 of them, the Catholic Association, all said we don't believe in sex outside of marriage, period. We don't care if it's homosexual or heterosexual. That is our belief system. And Vanderbilt says that's discrimination on the basis of sex, and you're no longer recognized as a student group. That's the exact same policy that we have here at UT and the Board of Regents, that all it needs to be interpreted is now you're discriminating on the basis of someone's sex or sexuality, and boom. I would hope that members of this committee would say, gee, I wish we'd voted for that bill when we had the chance, because now we're going to have to reverse a policy that we could have stopped.
Thank you.
Thank you. Chairman Brooks, you're recognized.
I do sincerely appreciate your information.
Sure.
Barring a Supreme Court interpretation, is there anything the federal government could do if we were to pass this that would nullify this?
You're talking about the U.S. Supreme Court.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Is there anything?
Can the feds rewrite that policy that they have in reference to discrimination that would trump this statute?
Well, I give you the honest answer.
Yeah.
The answer is yes, but it's not because of this.
But they would have to rewrite their statute in regard to that phrase that Mr. Gregory read.
Yeah. The bottom line is, our public colleges get federal funds. So anything they want to do, they can do.
Right.
If they want to say this, you have to be able to spin a hula hoop around your waist for 2 minutes to graduate from a degree in psychology, or else we won't send you federal money. They can. So I'm not trying to be
No, I understand.
flippant,
I'm just
but yeah, I mean, I can't tell you
right.
unless
But
the state
lacking
rises
that,
up. Yeah.
then this would resolve any issue that we anticipate, and that this should serve us well, and we won't have to be amending this for the next foreseeable future.
That would be my understanding. And let me mention that this is laws have been passed in Arizona, where this did come up. They've been passed in Ohio, and just recently were passed in Virginia, and it's at the desk of the governor of Virginia right now for their public colleges. There's also bills in Texas pending to do the same thing.
Has this language in other states been challenged in court, and if so, what were the results?
No, it has not been challenged in court, to my knowledge, in any of those three that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's 3 that have passed it, waiting for a 4th signature.
That's correct.
Okay.
I think the law in Arizona was passed in 2011. I can't remember when it was passed in Ohio, and obviously it's just now passed in Virginia. But the Arizona law has been on the books since 2011 legislative session.
Okay, because I mean, my thought too that if we move this out and it passes on the floor, governor signs it, he's good with it, then we're not going to have to worry about coming back and amending or changing this, because one thing that helps the universities, if we're constantly changing their policy,
That's correct.
then there is a state of confusion. So I want to make sure that if this moves on out and it passes and the governor signs it, that we're not back next year or the year after that trying to tinker with this, but you're convinced and you're confident that this is the language that will resolve all known issues.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
All known issues, and I would say, if I might, that the actual language that's the guts of the bill, what you can't do and cannot do, that was actually the subject of an AG opinion on last year's bill. And the Attorney General held that bill was constitutional last year as it applied to the public universities. It wasn't as applied to the private because of a particular issue about the funding. So this language has already really been vetted by the AG and said there's nothing at least unconstitutional about this language as it applies to our public schools. So I don't know if that's responsive, but at least the AG's looked at it and said, as far as our public schools, what you did last year would have been fine. This is the language that we had from last year. Does that help?
Any further questions while we're in recess? Seeing none, we're now back in session. We're now back on House Bill 534.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Fogarty? Okay, the question has been called for. Final comments by Representative Potter. You're recognized, sir.